hadn't planned on doing a video today, but I had an extensive conversation with a professional financial advisor that I have a lot of respect for. My son, Trent Grinkmeyer, runs a practice through Commonwealth, and he and I had a conversation as to the effects of the pandemic and what it was going to do to the economy. And he's on the side that this is going to be comparable to the Great Depression of the 1930s, and I happen to disagree with him, but I respect his opinion, and so I think this was somewhat driven by the video I did just yesterday. Why does the market keep going up? And 12 reasons why it is going up. And his argument is one that the employment is so terrible that the markets will eventually come to grips with that, and we will have another substantial drop, and it'll go down to probably 40 to 50% of what was the high in around the end of February. I don't agree with that, so I got up this morning early and did some research to either shore up his opinion or my opinion. And I basically determined that there's a tremendous difference here, and the biggest difference is how our government is reacting to it. First of all, let's address the unemployment issue. The Depression was caused by banking errors, by lack of demand for product, and an overextension of the market. And so unemployment did get up to approaching 20%, kind of where we think it's going to end up here. But the fact is that was permanent unemployment. What we have is temporary unemployment. We have demand for product. We have the situation, though, where most of the people are furloughed. So when the pandemic is brought under control, which I think it will be, and that's the next topic I want to speak to at the end of this video, is we need to practice some risk management within the government and within the CDC to give you and I a position of how to measure our risk of getting this. But let's focus on unemployment. Right now, the bulk of our unemployment is temporary unemployment. Roughly of the unemployment, probably 85%. Non-temporary, which will be permanent losses of jobs, and those will basically come from companies that go bankrupt or cannot survive the virus. That only represents somewhere in the neighborhood of 15% of those people who aren't working today. So when this pandemic is settled in one way or the other, the majority of these people will go back to work. And this won't go 10 years like the Great Depression did. It hopefully, the going back we're having now is not such a negative effect. And if we do some risk control, as I'm going to speak to later, possibly we can get back. Here's a look at the numbers of temporary layoffs as opposed to long-term layoffs. Very different than that of the time from the Great Depression. If we look at how the market is affected by corrections, there's basically three types of corrections: structural, cyclical, and event-driven. And then what is the average decline accordingly? Let's look at this graph and you can see the average decline is somewhere around 40%. If it's structural, much like it was in the Great Depression, it can go down to 60%. If it's cyclical, it's just something that happens and we have them on a regular basis. It goes down somewhere in the vicinity of 30%. And then if it's event-driven, as this one is, the market goes down somewhere around 25 to 28%. And that's what we have since experienced. Then we look at the average length, and you can see, again, if it's event-driven, it's substantially less. It's somewhere under 10 months that the market shows that correction. And then the average time to recover, as again, if it's structural, as the Great Depression was, it can take a matter of years. Whereas if it's event-driven, history says it'll take somewhere in the matter of short-term months. So it is very different than the Depression. And then the third reason is the way that the government reacted to the Depression, as opposed to how the government is reacting to the pandemic. And it's totally opposite. Back in the 30s, the government actually went into austerity measures by cutting down spending, by reducing the amount of support that they gave, by raising interest rates, and then they passed an act, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, which basically put tariffs on products coming into the country and shut down global demand for our products. Well, we do have a tariff situation, but that's a back burner because, again, we're trying to get our economy going. We have put somewhere in the neighborhood of $3 trillion and are considering putting another $3 trillion in. And in what way we put that in, I'm quite sure it will enter in, and we're supporting the economy. So I don't see that there is any correlation or any real intelligence that we can take from the Depression to ascertain how this is going to play out. I think more appropriate is that of the subprime crisis, which I'm a bit more familiar with, where it took us a time to react, but when we did react, we again pumped money into the economy, and as I've shown you on numerous times, the economy spiked, went up substantially over the next 10 years, and that has brought us to where we are now. The next issue I really want to talk about is, my wife and I talk about this quite a bit, because she is asking me, when is this going to get out? When are we going to be able to get out? And I keep going back to the premise that we need to know what our risk is, what level of risk we are taking on if we go with friends to dinner, if we get back to our Sunday morning coffee and breakfast with our friends, if we get back to our Wednesday afternoon lunches, if we go out to dinner at the restaurants that we like. What is the risk that we take in? And where I think they're missing it, when I say they, I mean the government, is I'm hoping that every individual that gets this virus and shows up at a hotel, they're creating a profile on. They know their age, they know their race, they know their economic situation, they know where they've been, they know the exposure they've had, they know their pre-existing health conditions, and they can put that into a database. And what I've talked about numerous times is we have the capability to take that data and sort it and analyze it, and then put artificial intelligence to it, and come back to people like me and you and say, okay, this is your risk level in your situation. And let's use me as an example. I'm 75 years old. I'm in good health. I have strong lungs. I can do a 100-meter dash in less than 17 seconds. I can do a 200-meter dash in less than 36 seconds. So when I get to that finish line, my lungs are screaming. So I know that my lungs are strong. Knowing that, and if my doctor knows that, and the data knows that, what is my risk? Measure that against other 75 or other 65 and older people who are in my health condition. They know my weight, they know my height, they They know about my ability to run. They know how many steps I take a day. What's my risk factor? Am I, do I have, if I am exposed to it, am I 50% probability to get it? And then what is my probability to survive it? If you are 22 years old and you're in good health, what is your probability? Because once we have those numbers, you and I can make good decisions. Until we have those numbers, we can't. We're shooting in the dark just like everybody else. But if we can categorize it down to people over 60 years of age who are overweight, who have a history of smoking, who have a history of lung problems, who have a history of stroke, who have a history of heart failure, if we can zero it down and say these people are 70% of those people who get it and 90% of those people who die from it, well then we can then say, okay, that's the part of the herd we've got to keep isolated. That's the part of the herd that we have to get away from the rest of the herd, and we will isolate them. But the rest of the herd continue to go to work and can bring this economy back. I think this is, I don't know why I'm having to come up with this. I think this is simple. Because again, look at these numbers. We have the statistics on virtually everything that is potentially going to kill me. I know that I have a 193 people out of 100,000 people in 2014 died from cardiovascular disease. I know that 186 out of 100,000 died of cancer. By the way, that's something in the neighborhood of 1,800 people a day. That's substantially high. My risk of dying tomorrow of cancer or cardiovascular disease, I suspect, is substantially higher than that of the coronavirus. At the same token, and knowing that, that's why I get out and walk every day. That's why I go to the track and run that 100-meter dash and put my lungs into those conditions, because I know where my risk lies. And that's what I need to learn from the the CDC or whatever, and our government. They have the data. Give it to the right people. Give it to IBM. Give it to Microsoft. Give it to Amazon Web Services, and let them tell you, and then share it with me. What is my risk factor? And then I'll make a decision as to how I want to live my life. Again, to the financial advisors, this is not a Great Depression. If we approach this properly, if we approach it like any other risk position, and again, I know as a result of these numbers that if I get involved in drugs, I have a 15 out of 100,000 chance of dying from drug abuse. I suspect that number's up substantially as a result of the opioid epidemic, because these numbers were done in 2014. I had 25 people last year got struck by lightning. Catastrophic storms, 61 people. So we know our risk factors. We need to know our risk factor relative to coronavirus. And no, this is not another Great Depression.